So, from a purely political perspective, it would be very difficult. There was some thought back before the elections that, in fact, if Mousavi had won, it would be much more difficult for someone who was perceived and branded as a reformer to negotiate with the U.S. because he would be constantly accused of being weak, and that any kind of compromise that would be acceptable to us on sort of nuclear oversight, reintroducing the IAEA, stopping the militarization programs, would be much, much harder for someone who's already perceived as a reformer and westernizer to implement than somebody who was more perceived to be a conservative. So there's two different tracks going on here. One is the U.S. wants the reform movement in Iran to succeed because we favor freedom and democracy and the rule of law everywhere, and we oppose regime violence everywhere. That's one track. And then the question is, what can we do about that? And the answer is not all that much. And there's been a lot of ink spilled over that. And as you said, the administration has gotten to the position of lending what moral support it can while being careful not to do anything that allows Ahmadinejad to run around and say, see, the opposition is being propped up by the West. So that's one track. The separate track is you have the problem of Iran's nuclear program, Iran's support for Hezbollah, Iran's destabilizing activities in Iraq, and how those impinge on U.S. security interests and those of our allies. And you have the question of what deals can be reached with Iran that will cause those to be more manageable, to be corralled over time. And those are two different channels that just don't. You shouldn't conflate them into if Mousavi becomes president of Iran, everything will be great.
I don't think that simply Mousavi becoming president of Iran is that everything is great. But I just don't. I think that I go by this following maxim: the people who are terrorizing their own people are also terrorizing the world, and that the argument that somehow they would be able to act in their own national interest, and there's a series of incentives and disincentives, is just to ignore history and is fanciful, because there has been an effort to offer very generous incentives to the Iranians, from Javier Solana and through the track that was supported by Bush to Obama's own diplomacy before the election. There has been an effort to try to deal with this sort of hardcore of the regime. And the truth of the matter is these two things are very deeply connected, because in order to maintain the rationale and justification for an Islamic republic that is now kind of transformed into a Stalinist dictatorship, you need to have constant vigilance against an external enemy, and you also need to, and so these two things go very much hand in hand. I disagree. I think that Mousavi, if he had been allowed to win the election, which no one's ever going to know what the vote count was, but clearly the numbers were somewhat inflated to I think it's fair to say, avoid a second round, and so forth. But it's, I think, a little bit beyond that. I mean, I've been saying for a while there's a legitimation crisis in Iran, and now it's really come through. And I'm saying that everybody who is somewhat reasonable is now barred from power. We saw this beginning in 2003 and 2004, but it's really kind of the revolution has truly eaten itself. It's sort of and at this point the people left are I think they might be rational within their own revolutionary logic, but to kind of keep pretending that there's a deal and that there's things that we can say and that there's some balance, and if we is delusionary. And I think that it's not me just saying that. It's not neocons saying that. It's like Sarkozy saying that. The Europeans have been trying to get a deal with the Iranians for some time, and to convince them that they do not need to have a nuclear weapons program and continue to support terrorism and all of these things that we want them to stop doing, and they have not shown any interest. And the people who used to be the argument that, well, if we could only get to the kind of more rational actors in the regime, have now been, stripped of power. I mean, when Rafsanjani's daughter is briefly arrested, and you see, aides to Mohsen Razali's children killed in prison, which we have in the paper today. Things like that, Heather, I just think it suggests that what's left is the rump of this revolution. They're not going to negotiate with evil infidels like us. They're not going to give up their nuclear program, whereas you would have a chance if you had people who I think that I guess I was saying that the rational elements are in the process of being purged right now.
I mean, Eli, I don't disagree with you about what's going on inside Iran. So then the question comes, the U.S. has very, very, very tiny points of leverage over what happens in Tehran. And frankly, they're mostly negative in terms of there are things we can do that make it easier for Ahmadinejad to hold power. There are things we can do that unite sort of nationalist support around him. And so the first key is not to do those things. And then the second key is to do things affirmatively that force Ahmadinejad to reveal himself again and again, to be an autocrat, to be not fully rational, to be placing his own sort of narrow vision ahead of the survival and welfare of the society as a whole. And frankly, holding out the prospect of negotiations is a great way to do that, because why would the guy not engage?
I didn't argue that we shouldn't hold out the prospect of negotiations. I mean, I think that's somewhat clever because, you let them stew. I just don't think that I'm just making a more basic point, which is that there's not going to be any negotiations aren't going to get anywhere. And I'm not,
I think 10 minutes ago I was actually the one who said that nothing was going to happen on Iran, but